Now it's the time of our special guest. We are honored to host Toni Whited as keynote speaker connected by video conference. Toni is an eminent professor at the University of Michigan and ranges in a wide variety of areas in finance and macroeconomics. She is a PhD at Princeton University and has published in the economics and finance journals. She has won a Jensen Prize for one of the top articles in corporate finance in the Journal of Financial Economics, as well as twice a Brettel Prize for one of the top articles in Journal of Finance. She currently serves as co-editor for the Journal of Financial Economics. The title of her today's speech is Integrating Reduced Form and Structural Work. Toni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that nice invitation. Let me share my screen one moment and move things around. Can everybody see me? Okay, let me go. So the title of my talk is Why Can't I Have Both? Integrating Reduced Form and Structural Work. And I thought that to start my talk, given that I'm actually now the editor-in-chief, I haven't been demoted of the JFE, I think it's important to say that although I am going to talk about a specific methodology, in no way do I think this is the only way to do research. I think the JFE welcomes lots of stuff. And that's how the field should progress. The field blossoms from the ground up, not from the top down. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me get started. So one problem with this talk is that the topics are actually not that well defined, and not in a sense that they are fuzzy inherently. It's that they mean different things to different people, and it's really just a semantic problem. So I thought it would be useful to define terms. So what can reduced form mean? It can mean a regression derived from an economic model. It can also mean something like what happens when you solve a 3-stage least squares problem in graduate school. That's the old Cowles Foundation definition. And structural also means different things to different people. It means a type of model, could mean a type of empirical work. And all of these definitions are fine. No one is better than the other, but they're confusing. And so I thought it would be useful to tell you what I mean by these things so that we can understand what's going on better. Okay, so statistical and economic models. A statistical model describes the relation between two or more random variables. And this is something we've all seen. Y equals X beta plus U. And what do reduced form techniques aim to do? They want to get at beta. They want to get an estimate of beta. Economic models are different. So they start out with assumptions about agents' preferences, constraints, firms' production functions, some notion of equilibrium and optimization. And then these models generate predictions about the relation between observable and often endogenous variables. So we're starting from very different basic underlying structures. One is just a regression, and the other is just an economic model. So what does structural estimation do with this model? The goal is to figure out whether optimal decisions implied by a model look anything like the decisions by actual people in the economy. And so how do you figure that out? You estimate an economic model's parameters, and then you assess the model fit. And so what do these parameters look like? There's things like preference parameters. So the asset pricers since time immemorial have been trying to figure out risk aversion coefficients, for example. Technology parameters, the IO economists have been trying to figure out the returns to scale in production forever. And then sometimes things like other time invariant institutional features, bargaining power, financial frictions, things like that. What kind of econometrics can you use? A whole bunch of stuff. GMM, MLE, we all know that. SMM, simulated method of moments, which lies under the umbrella construct of simulated minimum distance, simulated maximum likelihood, indirect inference, which is another name for simulated minimum distance, and all of the really cool two-steps stuff that the IO folks use. So lots of things that count as structural econometrics. I think they're both useful. About 10 years ago, in the finance profession, there were all these fights about which one of these things was better than the other. And these fights are silly because they're both useful for different purposes. And I used to be when I was young and didn't have any money, I used to fix my own bicycle. So I had lots of tools. And you don't need one tool. You need lots of different tools to fix bicycles, and you need lots of different statistical tools to answer interesting economic questions. So reduced form is great for getting at answers to causal questions. It's perfect. Like, this is the bread and butter of program evaluations. These have featured strongly in areas like labor economics, health economics, where governments intentionally intervene into the lives of human beings. And so we want to understand the effects of these programs. In other fields, including corporate finance and other fields like industrial organization, they're one part of a larger picture. And the reason is because it's harder to get at things like mechanisms. So why did this program have this effect? You need assumptions to do that, and that's fine. We all make assumptions. Everything's assumptions. Structural is different. Structural is actually not so great at getting at causality, except in the sense of a program evaluation. It's good at getting different kinds of causality. So you're not going to get I have exogenous variation and I determined that A causes B in that direction. You're not going to get that, but you can do different kinds of causal inference, and they're complementary, utterly complementary. So structural is useful for questions involving the word why, but it requires a mathematical model. I'm from a family of humanities professors. And so I think that I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent. I think that in economics, we think that verbal reasoning is easy. That's ridiculous. It's so hard. Oh my goodness. The things that members of my family have done to do careful verbal reasoning is tough. It's one reason why I do mathy stuff, because it's so much easier. So people think that mathematical models are harder or that verbal reasoning is easier. And the answer is, once again, it really depends. Some questions are good with verbal reasoning, some with mathematical reasoning, but structural is one of the things that requires mathematical reasoning. So you can ask counterfactual, what if questions. You can calculate impulse responses, like if you shock that variable, what happens? You can also get a lot of economic intuition. And I think that often, and this is something I am seeing so much in applied microeconomics right now. I'm on a bunch of committees in the economics department at Michigan, and all of the students are doing these dissertations where they do both. And so often a richer answer to a question involves both methods. So that was kind of abstract. And I think it's hard to understand this idea without a whole bunch of interesting examples. So I am going to categorize this integration into 5 types. And then I'm going to talk about some really interesting papers. A couple of them are my own. Sorry about that, but it's something I've been doing, and I'm not going to talk, certainly not going to talk all about my work. And so I'm going to give a bunch of examples from some interesting papers to illustrate how this works. What's the first type? The model incorporates reduced form shocks. What's the second type? Part of the model is simplified via a reduced form regression to reduce complexity. 3, model extends the external validity of the reduced form results. The next is kind of the converse. A reduced form regression serves as a check of external validity of the model. And then you can also use models to address regression selection problems. And so that's a little bit of a category unto itself, but there's some very nice papers in that area. Okay, let's do type 1. And how does this work? First, you build a model to incorporate some reduced form shocks. I'll talk about this lottery paper in a bit. And so the model is actually features that shock. It's there in the model and you assume it's exogenous. And why? You want to understand the importance of unobservable parameters that drive the reduced form exercises. So you start with a clean natural experiment and you get a causal effect, like lotteries cause this. So you know a direction, but you don't really know why. And so what you can do is then incorporate that shock into a model and see how deeper parameters change that causal relation. And that's a way to get at economic mechanisms. So you can observe counterfactuals and you can provide estimation by tying everything together. So I'd like to talk about a really neat paper. I like this. Oh, excuse me. Why not? To provide identification. So shocks don't provide identification in structural. I have this paper with my former student, Jay Kang, and we made the point that everything requires assumptions. No variation is exogenous without assumptions, because the only reason why it's relevant is because people react to it. So you have to assume the reaction is exogenous, not the variation. And that's fine. We all make assumptions. It's great. Structural makes different kinds of assumptions. And so, like I said, these things are complementary. The other reason is something I touched on before, is that causal elasticities, we often don't know why they go in a certain direction or why they go up or down. And so you can, because they're influenced by more than one economic parameter or economic force. And this is why we see at the end of many reduced form papers, all of these cross-sectional tests that researchers do to uncover mechanisms. I think a cleaner way to do it is to do it with structural. So here's the paper I like so much. It's Briggs, Cesarini, Lindquist, and Östling, and I probably mispronounced that, and all my apologies. So this paper is called Windfall Gains and Stock Market Participation, and it's got 3 research questions. So 1, what happens to stock market participation after cash windfalls? That's kind of an old question, but they add enough texture that the paper's still pretty interesting. Why are some households not participating in the stock market? That's more interesting. And then what exactly are the costs, or it turns out behavioral biases, that prevent them from doing so? So I'm going to go through the paper and try to illustrate how this paper integrates reduced form and structural. So what's the reduced form part? It's very cool. So they've got Swedish data and they've got Swedish lottery data, and a lottery is random. And so that's an exogenous shock to household wealth. But they've got something more that's kind of neat. They've got random assignment, not only of the lottery, but the way in which the prize is administered. You can either have a one-time lump sum payment, or you can have an annuitized payment. And the recipient doesn't get to choose, that is randomized. So this is pretty neat, because with those differences, you can try to figure out just from the reduced form regression, is it a one-time entry cost that's keeping people out of the stock market? Or is it a per period participation cost? And so that's one reason why this particular empirical setting is so clean and so nice, is that it can not only figure out what happens, but it can distinguish different types of costs. And so that's already pretty nice. So what do they get? let's say a household gets 150,000 equivalent US dollar windfall lottery prize. That increases the probability of stock ownership by 4%. So it's not much. The effect is concentrated in folks who were not participants before and in the lump sum prize payments. So it didn't show up in the monthly installments. And so this last item shows that this one-time entry cost explains a lot of household stock market non-participation. It's no sense that there's this per period or small sort of flow cost. It's a big lump sum upfront cost. The word cost is very ambiguous for a reason. It's hard to know what the cost is. And so that's where the structural part comes in. So what do? They write down a life cycle model. They have costly stock market participation and an unexpected lottery prize windfall. So the lottery prize windfall is in the model, exactly. And then they estimate simulated minimum distance. And one of the targets that they try to match is that elasticity, is the elasticity of participation with respect to the lottery. So they're trying to get that elasticity in the model as close as possible to that elasticity in the data. The causalness, if that's a word, of that elasticity doesn't matter. It's just that they're trying to get it close. And so it's empirically relevant. So what questions can you answer with the structural part? A whole bunch of them. So how big does this entry cost have to be to explain the data? Can't do that with reduced form. They find that the average entry cost for is over 31,000 US dollars. So it's very large. And this doesn't even quite get it all the way there. Like, this is as good as they can get the fit of the model, but even that cost doesn't get it all the way there. Then they try some alternatives, like, do models with behavioral biases help? Nah, not really. Something that's been very interesting, I'd say, in economics and finance in the last 5-10 years is all of this study of non-standard expectations. So they incorporate some non-standard expectations into the model. And what do you know? That helps a little bit. And so they determined that it's really not behavioral biases, and it's more about expectations. And then finally, the best part of the paper is they also have some survey data on beliefs that backs up this inference that came from a model. So this is kind of nice. I like this paper a lot. So this paper combines two things. And what do we learn that we couldn't learn otherwise? So the reduced form part has an exogenous shock to household income, and it is clean. Lotteries are random. The choice to participate in the lottery is maybe not as random, but the lottery itself is random. And apparently the choice is not that non-random in Sweden. So I thought that was nice. So this gives you identification of the directional effect of wealth on participation. Like, wealth causes more participation, and they have this cool setting of the random type that lets them figure out which type of cost is driving the result. That's pretty nice. So that's a different dimension of causality that you can get straight from the institutional setting. That's lovely. So that's already a pretty nice paper, but the structural part gives you even more. So the structural part gives you can quantify the size of the cost. Pretty cool. And you can eliminate possible explanations for non-participation. Would the structural part stand on its own? Probably not, actually. You need the reduced form stuff there to give you a puzzle to answer, and a very clean puzzle to answer. If you have a muddy puzzle to answer, it's a little bit harder. If you have a clean puzzle to answer, I think that's a very nice way in which structural can truly complement reduced form studies. So there we go. That's type 1. There are many more examples. There's lots and lots of examples. This just happens to be a really clean example. Type 2. So part of the model is simplified via a reduced form regression to reduce complexity. A lot of models are super complex. And even in the age of GPUs and supercomputers, the model's still too complex. So what folks do is they simplify part of the model whose mechanism is, first, too complicated, and two, doesn't really affect much else in the model. So what falls under that category? All of the currently very popular demand estimation methods fit in this category. So all of the Barry Levins and Pecos stuff that you see, or the Barry 1994 stuff that you see out there in corporate finance, banking and the like, it all fits in this. So a lot of stuff is being simplified via a reduced form example. The other type of stuff that does this is also from the industrial organization literature. And these are these conditional choice probability methods. This is from Hotson Miller. I'll explain that in a bit. And a policy function approach from Bayari, Bankart, and Levin. I'll talk about the CCP stuff. Kang, Lowry, and Wardlaw uses the CCP methods, and Matvos and Seru use the BBL methods. I want to talk about Kang, Lowry, and Wardlaw because I think this is an underappreciated paper whose methods could be widely used in many ways in finance and economics. So let's do it. The cost of closing failed banks, a structural estimation of regulatory incentives. This is an interesting question. Like, what are regulatory incentives? Are these regulators just out to do the right thing all the time, or do they have other things going on? That's interesting. And so the very specific question is, how do regulators choose whether to close a troubled bank? That's interesting. It matters for the stability of the financial system. It matters for balancing budgets. It matters for future depositor expectations. It's a very important question. So what do? They have a dynamic discrete choice model. So this is just a dynamic optimization model, except the choice is discrete. And so in this case, it's close open. You either close the bank or you don't close the bank. What drives the choice? These regulators have aversions to closing the banks. Why? Political influence, laziness, things like that. But then they also have some rational incentives. They realize that if they leave a troubled bank open too long, that's higher risk and future deposit insurance costs from if they delay closure. So there's a trade-off, a very clearly defined trade-off with an agency problem on one side, rational cost avoidance on the other, that determines this open-close decision. So here's the genius of the Hotz-Miller stuff. It's really cool. It's one of those things that you think is so obvious after the fact, but was so not obvious before the fact. So it turns out that the difference, or actually the ratio of regulator utility from each decision, like you get some utility from open, another utility from closed, is proportional to the probability of each decision. That's really slick. And why is it really slick? Because you can estimate the latter with a logit. Pretty cool, huh? So that's where the simplification comes in. These types of structural methods, in comparison to things like simulated minimum distance, do not require a supercomputer. You can do them on a laptop. It's pretty easy. And so you estimate the logits. So you know the ratio of probabilities. Once you know the ratio of probabilities, you know the ratio of utilities. Once you know the ratio of utilities, you can do counterfactuals. So here's the final conclusion. Delayed closures are driven by desire to defer costs and aversion to closing the largest and smallest troubled banks and political influence. So that's pretty nice. I think this is an underappreciated paper and a very underappreciated method in corporate finance, super easy to compute. And there's so many discrete choices out there, widely applicable. Okay, oops. Okay, here's one of my papers. This is neat. So this is market power and monetary policy transmission, evidence from a structural estimation. So we're asking a question. This is also about regulatory frictions and market power. So to what extent do market power and regulatory frictions affect the pass-through of policy rates to bank lending decisions? And this is a structural equation because you can't see market power. Regulatory frictions are hard to understand because they never change. There's hardly any variation in regulatory frictions. And so you don't know what's going on. Here's the problem. The model has to be really complicated. There has to be an equilibrium between borrowers, lenders, and banks. That is one fixed point to solve. There's imperfect competition between banks. That's another fixed point to solve. So now we've got a nested fixed point. And then there are dynamic optimizations by banks. So you've got a nested fixed point. It's a mess. You can't do that. But here's how we simplify it. We estimate loan and demand deposit elasticities, reduced form. And we just use the methods in Barry Levinson and Pecos. But then that's cool. Because what do elasticities give you? They tell you, if this is the price, that's the quantity. So all we have to do is have banks optimize over prices, and we know the quantities, and the market automatically clears. So we just eliminated a fixed point, and we can estimate the rest of the model with simulated minimum distance. Deposit market power matters a lot for the pass-through of the federal funds rate to lending rates, but so does bank capital regulation. Bank capital and deposit market power actually generate a reversal rate at about 2%. Below that, monetary policy has the opposite effect of what you'd expect. And then we also have some stylized facts that support these things. So as for type 2, there's a couple of things you can do. You can, just to summarize, you can do some CCP stuff, conditional choice probability, that lets you do reduced form stuff to understand some structural questions, or you can use demand estimation to let markets clear within a market or within a model. Type 3. The model is used to extend the external validity of the reduced form results. This is a classic thing about the classic problem with a lot of reduced form studies is that they can have lovely internal validity, like clean, and then it's applicable to what? So then that's a problem. And there are lots of examples in urban and environmental economics. The other thing you can do is predict the effects of non-compliers in a reduced form regression. Okay, so let's do this. Here's another paper that I like a lot. Who creates new firms when local opportunities arise? So this is a paper about entrepreneurship, and they've got a reasonably clean shock. So, and really nice data. So they have Brazilian matched employer-employee data. They've got a lot of really cool employee characteristics. And then they ask whether a change in global commodity prices affects local entrepreneurial activity. They do a pretty nice job of generating Bartik-style variation in the income of these municipalities. So they've got this exogenous shock to municipality income. And what do they find? Young entrepreneurs respond to these shocks more than older ones. And this strong response is concentrated in municipalities with more banking, with better banking and more skills. That second part is kind of obvious, but now, what else can they do? One thing that they don't have data on are strong changes in population composition. So they can ask a different question in a different dimension of causality, which is what would happen if population composition changed? So this paper extends everything beyond those previous causal elasticities. And so what do they have? A dynamic discrete choice problem between wage employment and entrepreneurship. And then they have a taste parameter, and that taste parameter gives selection into either entrepreneurship or wage employment, and they can discipline that with the data. So it's an empirical estimate of this preference. And they get some neat results out of the end by doing counterfactuals. 10% increase in the fraction of young people increases firm creation by about 2%. They can't do that with their data because they don't have enough variation to have the young people change. And if this increases in the young is concentrated in the non-educated, the effect is muted a lot. So I thought that was an interesting way to add more texture and extend the validity of the results. This is neat. So do the right firms survive bankruptcy? So this is about compliers and non-compliers, right? So compliers in an IV regression are those observations that are actually affected by the instrument, where the instrument bops them and they actually do what they're supposed to do in the right direction. So what's the first question? So are decisions to liquidate efficient, and does inefficient liquidation reduce creditor recovery? So what can he do with the reduced form part? So he's got a judge IV design, pretty standard. And so compliers are those cases that are affected in this predicted way by the judge's decision. So for compliers who are really close to the marginal threshold of liquidation versus emerging, liquidation reduces recovery by a lot, by like 58% on the dollar. What can he do with the structural part? He can extend the conclusion to non-compliers and finds that about 60% of liquidations are inefficient. So I think that's an interesting policy question that you couldn't get at without putting a little bit of structure on the data. So as I said before, he uses these randomly assigned judges as an exogenous shock to firm liquidation versus reorganization. Problem here is the result's just a local average treatment effect. It's only relevant to those judges that are mean and those firms that go into liquidation, or those judges that are nice and those firms that get to continue. Nothing else is, so those are the compliers, and it only affects the compliers. So what's the structural methodology? It's actually very simple. It's a Roy model. So this is the old, should I hunt or should I fish model? And it's a discrete choice between which gives me the higher utility, A or B. If you make some distributional assumptions, you can get something that looks pretty close to a Heckman correction. So it's a utility optimization problem that can turn into something that looks very close to a Heckman correction. And so it allows for a sample selection correction, because that's what complier non-complier is, right? It's sample selection to extend the result to non-compliers. And that was the result. Okay. Type 4. Reduced form is used to assess model validity. So this is something that's really important. And I think that early papers in structural corporate didn't do this. Why? We were kind of figuring out how the whole thing worked, and there was too much. And then we realized, no, this is really important. And so if you look at it, most papers in structural published in the last, 10 years, they all have this, and it's really important. So let me give you some background. So dynamic models always give you a lot of predictions. You can get lots of predictions out of them because they generate simulated data, predict a lot of stuff, lots of predictions. Some of these predictions are used to estimate the model. Like so this classic stuff I did with Hennessy, the model gives you a prediction about what firm leverage should be, and you can see if that matches with firm leverage in the data. But others are not. And you can be compared to actual data predictions. So there are these predictions in the data that are you force to be as close to the data as possible, predictions from the model. And there are the other ones that you don't force at all. I have this paper with Santiago Basdresh and Jake Han, and we formulate a test of these unused predictions, but there are many, many examples. Here's one. I like this paper a lot. Technological innovation and executive pay inequality. This is a paper that combines really cool data and a very nice model. So they find in the very good data that the executive pay and the gap between executive and worker pay have grown a lot in the last 50 years. Fine, whatever. So they estimate a model of technological innovation that helps us understand these facts. So what's this? The model's kind of interesting. Executives have the ability to find good projects and to do stuff. Workers just have the ability to do stuff. And as innovation keeps happening, the value of being able to find new projects goes up even more because of these properties of innovation models that are externality-like. So the model has some nice intuition based on innovation, but the model also has predictions about the relations between executive pay and innovation and executive pay and growth opportunities. And neither of those were used to estimate the model, but both certainly hold up in reduced form regressions. And then this is a recent paper of mine. It's called Taxes Depress Corporate Borrowing Evidence from Private Firms. So how do taxes affect capital structure? What does the reduced form part do? It does a staggered diff and diff around state corporate tax changes using all the new nice modern diff and diff stuff to establish causality, taxes depress leverage, which is the wrong way, and sign and magnitude. So what does the structural part do? It illustrates the intuition, and it uses the elasticity as an external validation. So that elasticity was not used to discipline the model. So the model isn't forced to match it in any way, and yet it does. And then uses counterfactuals to understand the mechanism behind the elasticity. So the paper has this kind of newish data on private firms. It's from the Federal Reserve. And we do a staggered diff and diff around changes in state corporate taxes since the late 1980s. And we distinguish between enactment and effective dates. And we obtain these nice directional findings. Corporate leverage increases following tax cuts and decreases following tax hikes, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd expect from the tax benefit of debt. Firms increase investment following tax cuts, and the ones that are affected the most are small, healthy, private firms. And then that's a weird result. So we estimate a model, it's an equilibrium model of an economy. Firms are financed by profits and risky debt. They make hiring, debt, investment decisions in anticipation of taxes. And the interest expense is tax deductible. That's baked into the model. We've actually rigged the model against the empirical findings. And the diff and diff doesn't provide identification. We use it as a check on external validity, and we get it. So what do we learn from the structural part? We get intuition. So it turns out interest tax shields are not the only thing that are tax sensitive. Default costs are tax sensitive as well. And not for all firms all the time, but for very productive small firms, those tax sensitive default costs can be enough to flip the sign of the relation between taxes and leverage. It's kind of nice. What makes the elasticity negative? High fixed operating costs. So firms that are productive but have these big costs, and then low deadweight default costs. Here's another one. This is neat. Reputation and investor activism. So they ask, why do targets settle so frequently with activists? And because it's weird, right? Because these activists pay large costs of proxy fights. And so why would you settle if these folks are like paying all these costs? Shouldn't you just realize that they don't have that much bargaining power? And then why do activists do all these proxy fights despite the free rider problem? And so they estimate a model of activist reputation by MLE, and it's all about reputation. It's a really slick MLE application. But then they use the model-based reputation measure and to predict several outcomes like cumulative abnormal returns, 13D filings in both the model and the data, and they get it. And then finally, type 5. Type 5 is a little bit different from everything else, but it's very neat. The model is used to solve a selection problem in a regression. Actually, the original Heckman paper is structural. So a Heckman correction is basically a regression paired up with a probit. And a probit is just an outcome of a random utility problem, which is kind of sort of structural. The agent chooses to stay in the sample if their utility exceeds a threshold, and that's just a structural problem. But the selection model can be much more elaborate and much more realistic and give us a lot of texture. This is a super underappreciated paper. I don't know why. It's a really nicely done paper, and it asks an interesting question. Startup companies that are funded by more experienced VCs are more likely to go public. So is that selection or is it treatment? Like, is it the direct influence of the VC company, or do better VCs just sort with better companies? Good luck answering that question with a regression. So he's got a two-sided matching model. How does this work? Each VC can have more than one match, but each company can only have one VC. And you figure out a matching that's stable, which means that if you perturb the outcome, that would make somebody worse off. So you find a stable equilibrium that where if you bopped it, it would be worse off. Someone would be worse off. So here's what they do. They estimate the likelihood of an IPO jointly with the matching model using Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. That's exactly like a probit. Okay, probit can be reduced to a plug-in problem, but it is essentially estimating a probit jointly with a regression. And I know you can reduce it to a plug-in, but it's essentially the same thing. So what does the structural part do? It allows for separating the effects of influence versus sorting, because it's a sorting model. You quantify the effects of sorting, and then you've got the influence. And I think I'm done pretty close to on time. So I genuinely think that fighting about reduced form versus structural methods is a big fat waste of time. These methods answer different kinds of questions, and it's useful to have both hammers and screwdrivers and Allen wrenches and tire truers in your toolbox. You can use them separately. Not all papers have to have both. You can have pure structural papers, that's fine. I think that's actually less fine. Or you can have pure empirical papers. There are lots and lots of really nice pure empirical papers, and my favorite one is the Benitson-Nealis and Perez-Gonzalez and Wolfenson paper, which is about CEO turnover or family CEO turnover. Or you can use them together. That's really popular in applied microeconomics right now. And it takes about 5 years for this stuff to filter into corporate finance. So we're probably going to see more of it. And I think it helps us get better answers to more interesting questions. And that's kind of nice. And I'm done. Sorry for being offline. I have a good reason. Or not being in person.
Any question? Yeah.
Oh, good.
Thank you for the presentation. There was one of the types where you talked about the fact that the model makes lots of different predictions, lots of simulations, and there are things that weren't being used to discipline the model. Can you just talk a little bit about what that meant? Is that about like targeted moments versus untargeted moments? Is it about checking the validity of the model, or is it just about utilizing it more for more interesting counterfactuals?
So it's more about targeted versus untargeted, to use the macroeconomic lingo. So you have this plethora of things. Typically, I think you want to not target the stuff you're really interested in, because if you target something, you're almost forcing the model to fit it. I don't know if that's great. I think the things that you're really interested in are things that should come from the structure of the model, and not because you forced that particular feature of the data to fit with the model. So it's really more about targeted versus non-targeted moments. And I think there's a clear choice. You don't target the stuff you care about.
Toni, I'm struggling, with their philosophical question, if I may. And I think this is something which I see we have a lot in like pure finance, especially in asset pricing. We have a model. It's not quite structural, but kind of a model of how we understand the markets work. And then we do reduced form, basically empirical test. And we find that it doesn't work. And instead of saying, like, honestly, that, I think the model is wrong, we're saying, it's a puzzle. The model is correct, but it's a puzzle. And then we have hundreds of puzzles. And as a professional, I think we are still not facing, like in finance and asset pricing, the reality that our models are just wrong. Yeah, so they are too simple. And I'm not sure, do you think we are ready as a profession to actually face it and stop calling a puzzle, but saying, okay, let's find a better model which kind of, matches more moments.
Oh, probably not. So many people are so are so confrontation averse. So probably not. I think puzzle is just a euphemism for this model is wrong. Right? The equity premium puzzle is a euphemism for the original Hansen and Singleton model, while although path breaking, right? This paper changed asset pricing is too simple. And you can have both. You can have a paper be path-breaking and too simple. So I think it's just a euphemism. If I want to switch to corporate finance, one of the problems in corporate finance is that unlike asset pricing, we don't have canonical models. You all have consumption-based, production-based, intermediary-based asset pricing. You have some canonical models. We have nothing. And so it's harder for us even to define puzzles. Did that, you're smiling. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, Toni, this is Wilson from Cornell. It's always good to hear your talk. It's very inspiring. I want to hear your thoughts on a kind of a broader concept of structural estimation. I know we typically have models, right, to build a structural model. And it does a lot more than, it does many things that reduced form models don't do. Is it possible to take a data-driven way of estimating a structural model, in the sense that if you build a environment module where there are many regularities that we learn from reduced form models, right? Certain relationship that we want the parameters of the module to fit. Let's say we use a really elaborate neural net model so that it fits these empirical regularities, and then use that as a sort of a structural model to do certain counterfactual either prediction or high dimensional actions of managerial decision, for example. Would that be a reasonable approach as well? I know we don't get the theoretical intuition or insight right away, but this approach might be telling us something about what we should incorporate into the theory part.
Can I try to clarify and see if I understand your correct question, and then maybe if I'm right, I can answer?
Yeah.
So your idea is that you have an elaborate empirical model,
Yes.
and you use it to match some features that come from a theoretical model.
Match
that
the
right?
feature. Yeah, match the features still from the empirical patterns.
So
Typically, you want to estimate the structural
yeah.
matching moments, right? Of
Yeah.
the empirical. But here, there's a list of empirical regularities, but we do have a holistic model that describes the environment very well. And then you can ask the question then, or if I take a combination of policy actions, what happens?
I don't think that's structural. I think that's just a different type of reduced form. But then now we're into the semantics part, right?
Right.
I think when I think of structural, I think of a model that is based on understanding agent utility or some kind of technological constraints or something like that.
Right.
And so I think that what you're describing could potentially be very interesting. But I don't think it's structural per se.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my off the
makes sense.
so
yeah.
yeah, I have never heard that question. So those are just my immediate thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. We'd love to chat more. Thanks.
Hi, can I just ask you as an editor about this fight, about the likelihood of getting published?
Oh, so I think this was maybe 10 years ago, and I was a little bit involved in it. And there was some thoughts that structural sucks, and then other people were, not me, saying reduced form sucks. And these are just silly things to say, because I've accepted 5 gazillion reduced form papers, then that's great. I've accepted some structural papers. It's a smaller literature, so I've accepted smaller papers. I've accepted papers that do both, like the Cesarini paper. I really think it's important to tailor methodology to the question. And if you want to answer a question and you can do it simply and convincingly with reduced form, go for it. If you need to do structural, do structural. And or if you have a structural question that there's no way to incorporate reduced form, don't bother. I think there's a lot, I think it's very, very context dependent. And I like everything methodologically.
Hello, hi Toni.
Yeah.
So, one question. Do we ever estimate structural models directly in financial econometrics? I mean, or do we just estimate reduced form ones and then we use structural ones to make to identify sort of causal relations that we want to make inference on? You know what I mean? I'm struggling to think of an instance in which we ever estimate a structural model directly. I mean, what we estimate is the reduced form one, right? I mean, even when we do GMM, they are, okay, we estimate the moment conditions, right? But aren't they intrinsically, and intrinsically reduced form? They're regressions essentially, right? Estimated by OLS, by whatever, right? We have sample moments, right? So they are reduced form, right? And then we use a structural model to make inference, right?
I'm a little bit unclear on what your question is, so I'm going to try to answer it. And if I'm off base, let me know, and then we can iterate. So perhaps you're thinking about comparing moment-based estimation with MLE-based estimation. The Travis Johnson paper is quite nice. They've got a model, they solve it, it produces a likelihood. It's so cool.
Okay.
So that's that. And then I think you start getting into this whole other econometric argument that people ask, like what's better, MLE or moment-based? And then you get into the question of how seriously do you want to take the model? Like when you do MLE, you're taking the model very, very seriously. When you do moment-based estimation, you're asking less of the model. You're asking it only to get a few data facts right. When you're doing MLE, you're asking it to get the whole distribution right. And like for the Travis Johnson paper, that's the right kind of thing to do, because they're looking at a fairly simple setting, which is activist proxy fights. It's not a very complicated technological thing. And so I think that in that case, that works really well.
Okay, yes, no, that answers my question. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, a fully specified model estimated by maximum likelihood will be sort of a way of a structure, estimating directly a structural model. I mean, a parallel question, I mean, is that, I mean, what I find interesting is what they do in a sort of, for example, in statistics, right? They're experimenting with graphical models in which they directly impose restrictions. And I was wondering, you know, what your thoughts are on that way.
I have many thoughts on those. My stepson's a biostatistician, so we talk about this. The graphical models in the sciences are interesting because the sciences are very different from social sciences. They have laws of nature. Like genes do stuff, and rocks roll down hills and bump into other rocks. And so they have a very different type of theoretical background where you have forces. And then I think these graphical models make a lot of sense. The graphical models also make sense in the social sciences, but they're like a layer in between reduced form and structural. They'll tell you how things work and whether you've got a collider or a backward channel or something like that. But what they don't do is tell you what the underlying parameters are. So I think that these graphical methods play such a different role in the hard sciences versus the social sciences, because the models in the hard sciences are so different because they're based on physical forces. And our models are based on human optimization or human stupidity or human optimization in the face of stupidity, or all sorts of things like that. So I think of the graphical models as an intermediate step, where the structural might be able to tell you what the graphical model ought to look like.
Hi, Toni. Thanks a lot for the great presentation. So I have a question. So you mentioned a lot of methodologies like BBL, CCP, Monte Carlo macro chains. I was wondering, so you haven't mentioned anything about the machine learning. I was wondering if in machine learning, you know, you have some maybe examples of uses of machine learning for structural models as well.
So there's some folks who are using machine learning to try to actually solve models, right? I've tried those. They work really well with macro models, not so well with finance models because we've got kinks. And then you need the machine learning to be super high dimensional because getting a kink right is tough. I'm sure some very smart people will figure that problem out. I think of machine learning as useful for prediction. And so you certainly could do something like try to match a regularized regression result with something from a model. I think that could be really interesting, and no one's really done it yet. Finding some measure of fit would be a little bit challenging, but I think that's something that you certainly could do. I just haven't seen that much of it.
Many technical questions. And I hope that, you know, we have learned something that we can use in our own work. Now it's my time basically to offer you EFMA. I don't know if you see it. It's unfortunate that you could not make it, but we're gonna mail it to you.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm pretty sure you're gonna be receiving it soon.
Thank you, thank you.
Can you say it?
Oh, of course I can see it. Yeah. Thank you. And thank the audience for really interesting questions.
The next few things that I have to do.